All right. Let's jump into something that I feel like could keep philosophers like up all night tossing and turning.
Okay.
When we talk about evolution, what is actually being selected?
Right.
Is it just the organism, like the individual that we see,
Yeah,
or is it something else maybe at a different level?
that's a great question. And it's something that should resonate with you as a philosopher, right?
Yeah.
You're always thinking about units and levels and different, areas of thought.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because evolutionary biology has been grappling with this same question too. Like, what are the real units or targets of selection when it comes to evolution?
Exactly. And it's not just like, an abstract thought experiment. We have a really cool resource for this deep dive, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on units and levels of selection.
Perfect.
It's a really comprehensive piece that kind of lays out all the different ways that biologists and philosophers have thought about this.
And what's really fascinating is that there isn't like a single easy answer just waiting to be uncovered. Our goal today is to really explore the nuances of this question,
Yeah.
to kind of unpack it and show you that it's not as simple either, but rather a bunch of distinct but interconnected research questions that all fall under this umbrella of units of selection.
Totally. And we're going to run into some specific terms. And while they might sound a bit technical at first, they're crucial to kind of get a grasp on this whole landscape.
Right.
So we have like the interactor, what's directly engaging with the environment,
Right.
and the replicator, which is now broadened into the reproducer. So what's passing on that heritable information,
Okay.
the manifester of adaptation, what's actually showing those traits that have been shaped by evolution,
Right.
and then finally the beneficiary, like who is ultimately winning in this whole evolutionary game.
Exactly. And to kind of make this more concrete, let's think about like the initial intuition that we have when Darwin was observing those finches, or when we imagine a faster deer escaping a predator.
Right.
Our first thought is that the individual organism is what makes it or breaks it, right? It's what survives and reproduces or doesn't.
Yeah, it's like facing those pressures head on.
It seems to be facing the selective pressures directly.
But here's where it gets really interesting, that initial kind of clear picture has expanded a lot.
Totally.
So biologists started asking, well, could selection also work on other levels of biological organization?
Right. Could it be groups or even whole species?
Yeah, could it be groups or even species? And of course, the gene itself has
Mhm.
been kind of thrown in as a major player. And that's where we get a lot of the debate and complexity.
Yeah, that expansion is where things get really interesting.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's dig into some of these foundational questions that the source lays out.
Good. Sounds good.
The first one, and it's a crucial one, what entity is directly being selected? And this is called the interactor research question.
The interactive research question. I like that.
And a key definition here that the source brings up is from Hull, the interactor. So, an entity that interacts cohesively with its environment in a way that leads to differences in how well it replicates.
Okay.
So, think back to that speedy deer. Its speed is how it interacts with the wolf chasing it.
Right.
And that interaction directly affects whether it survives to reproduce or not.
I see. And this isn't like a brand new idea either, right?
Right.
The source points out that this goes back to Darwin and, the early evolutionary thinkers,
Yeah.
and researchers in what's called the evolutionary change school. They really focus on this idea that a unit of selection is something that responds to selection as a whole, regardless of how complex it is on the inside,
Right.
like a cohesive unit.
Yeah, like it's acting as one.
Exactly.
So, and I know some philosophers have raised some concerns about, whether this concept of an interactor is maybe a bit too broad.
Right. It's too vague.
Yeah, or whether the entities involved are always as cohesive as the definition suggests.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's important to remember that researchers who use these multi-level selection models like Wade and Goodnight, they actually employ pretty rigorous mathematical approaches to define and model this interactor role, right? They're looking at how this interaction can actually lead to these kind of emergent fitness differences at different levels.
So they're not just like waving their hands, they're like actually doing the math.
Exactly. They're doing the math.
And what's interesting from a philosophical perspective is that this interactor research question is adaptation neutral.
Okay.
It's really about the process of replication based on the interaction, not about whether the traits involved are good adaptations, like in an engineering sense.
I see. So it's not about the quality of the adaptation. It's just about the process of replication.
Exactly. Okay, so the second question is the replicator-reproducer research question. And this asks, what is the entity that passes on the heritable information?
Okay. So it's actually carrying the information across generations.
Exactly. So we encounter Dawkins' concept of the replicator here.
Right, the gene copying itself.
But the idea has actually broadened. So the source talks about the generalization to reproducer, and a lot of this is through the work of Griesper.
Yeah.
And this concept emphasizes the material transfer of genetic material, but even like epigenetic information, and also the developmental processes across generations.
So it's not just about the genes themselves, but also how they're expressed and how they develop over time.
Exactly. So a reproducer isn't just like a self-copying molecule. It's involved in this whole chain of inheritance and development.
Okay, so it's a much richer view of heredity.
Totally. And the source even mentions debates about the precise definition, especially when you bring in things like retroviral reproduction,
Oh yeah, that's a good example.
which shows that even this seemingly basic concept is still being refined.
Yeah, it's always more complicated than we think.
Always. Okay, so then we get to the third question, the manifestor of adaptation research question.
Okay.
So this asks, what is the entity that exhibits the adaptations?
Right, those traits that look like they were designed for a purpose?
Exactly the ones that appear so well suited to their environments.
Yeah, like a bird's wing.
But the source points out a really important ambiguity here.
Okay.
What do we even mean by adaptation?
Right.
Is it just a trait that's been shaped by selection? Or does it imply some kind of engineering perfection?
Okay, so is it just a product of the process, or is it actually perfectly designed for its function?
Yeah. And this distinction is important because the level at which we see these engineering adaptations might not be the same as the interactor.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, like a bird's wing, a clear adaptation at the organism level, it helps the individual bird, which is the interactor, interact with the environment.
Yeah.
But the genes that code for that wing, those are the reproducers.
So different levels are involved even in a single trait.
Absolutely. All right, final question, the beneficiary research question.
Okay, the ultimate winner.
This one often leads back to Dawkins' perspective, who ultimately benefits from this whole selection process in the long run.
So is it the organism or is it something else?
Well, Dawkins famously argued that it's the gene.
The gene.
So even though organisms, those interactors, are the ones directly interacting and being selected, it's the genes that are being passed on.
Right.
And in his view, they're the ones that ultimately benefit.
Interesting. So even though the organism is the one doing the interacting, it's the genes that are really winning in the evolutionary game.
Yeah, that's the argument. Okay, so what the source makes clear here is that this question of units of selection isn't just one big question.
Right.
It's actually a set of distinct, functional, yet interconnected questions.
It's like we have different lenses we can use to look at the same thing.
Yeah, it's like 4 different lenses through which we can examine evolution, each highlighting a different role.
That's a great way to put it. And understanding this helps us to appreciate the different research traditions that have come up in studying multi-level selection.
Okay.
The source identifies 2 main schools of thought here.
All right, so what's the first one?
The first one is the evolutionary chain school.
Okay, and what are they all about?
So this school is really focused on the process of evolutionary change as it occurs across different levels of organization.
Okay.
So they've done a lot of empirical work showing that selection acting on groups as interactors can actually drive evolution in a big way.
So they're looking at how groups can be selected as a unit, even if it's not always in the best interest of every individual within the group.
Exactly. They've even challenged some long-held assumptions about how often and under what conditions group selection can work.
So they're saying that group selection can happen more often than we previously thought.
Yes, and their key point is that group-level interactor selection can be a significant force in evolution, and they've got the studies to back it up.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And the second tradition is the adaptationist kin selection school.
Yes.
So that sounds like they're more interested in explaining those specific traits.
Right. This school is primarily concerned with understanding the evolution of adaptations, those traits that seem to be designed for a purpose.
Yeah, like they're perfectly engineered.
Exactly. They often look at things from the gene's point of view or focus on kin selection and inclusive fitness.
Okay, so inclusive fitness, meaning an organism's success, is not just about its own offspring, but also about the success of its relatives who share its genes.
Precisely, they're looking at the bigger picture of genetic success.
So they're aiming to explain why certain traits, these engineering adaptations, have evolved by looking at the benefits to the genes, either directly or through the organism's relatives.
Exactly. And they tend to focus on identifying optimal adaptations from this gene-centered perspective.
Okay, but the source points out a potential tension here.
What's that?
This school sometimes downplays the role of non-additive genetic effects, those complex interactions between genes that the evolutionary change school considers super important for selection at higher levels, like groups.
I see. So there's a difference in emphasis there.
Yeah, the adaptationist school wants to explain the perfection of adaptations from the gene's viewpoint, while the evolutionary change school wants to give a more accurate account of the actual processes, even if they don't always lead to the perfect outcome.
Okay, so one is focused on optimality and the other is focused on what actually happens in nature.
Exactly. And this difference becomes really clear when we look at specific debates about levels of selection, starting with the big one group selection.
Ah, group selection. That's a classic.
It's caused a lot of debate, hasn't it?
It has, and the source highlights that a lot of the confusion in the early group selection debates came from not clearly separating the interactor and the manifester of adaptation questions.
Right. So you have to remember those different roles we talked about.
Exactly. Early arguments often said that for groups to be units of selection, they had to show these complex engineering adaptations that benefit the whole group.
So it wasn't enough for a group to just survive and reproduce better than other groups. They also had to have traits that looked like they were designed specifically for the group.
Exactly. It was like they needed to be superorganisms.
But the evolutionary change perspective shifted the focus to seeing group selection mainly in terms of groups acting as interactors.
Right.
They showed theoretically and empirically that groups can be selected based on group-level traits that help them survive and reproduce, even if those traits aren't perfect adaptations in the engineering sense.
Okay, so it's not about perfection, it's about what works.
Exactly, and this contrasts with the adaptationist kin selection view, which often tries to explain behaviors that look like group adaptations through the lens of kin selection.
Right, they focus on the genetic relatedness within the group.
Yeah, the classic example is Hamilton's rule, herb greater than C.
Ah, yes, Hamilton's rule.
And the debate continues about how important and applicable these two perspectives are. The source even mentions the term new group selection, which was sometimes used by the adaptationist school to refer to the ideas of the evolutionary change school, often with a reinterpretation of the history of multi-level selection theory.
So it's not just about the science itself, but also about how we understand the history of the field.
Exactly, and the source emphasizes how the evolutionary change proponents have shown that group selection can work even in situations where the adaptationist school thought it wouldn't.
That's interesting.
They've even proposed new explanations for the evolution of cooperation that move beyond the traditional focus on the cheater fallacy.
So they're pushing the boundaries of our understanding of how cooperation can evolve.
Totally. All right, moving up a level, we have species selection.
Species selection.
Did a similar mixing of ideas happen in those debates?
It did. The source explains that early discussions about species selection also often blurred the lines between the interactor and manifester roles.
Right.
Paleontologists sometimes argued that for species to be real units of selection, they needed to have these species-level emergent properties.
Right.
Again, thinking about adaptations at the species level.
So again, it's not enough for them to just exist. They have to have these special traits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if we think of species or lineages as interactors, where selection acts on lineage-wide traits, like the rate of speciation or extinction, then the idea of species selection makes more sense.
Okay, so instead of looking for specific adaptations at the species level, we're looking at how lineages as a whole interact with their environment.
Right, we're looking at things like how often they split into new species or how likely they are to go extinct.
So a species with a lot of genetic diversity might be more likely to survive environmental changes and give rise to new species.
Exactly, and in that scenario, the variability itself is the lineage-level trait being selected for.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these different levels all fit together.
It's all connected.
Now let's turn to the gene's eye view with agenic selectionism and genic pluralism.
Ah, yes, this is where Richard Dawkins comes in.
Exactly. So genic selectionism, as championed by Dawkins and George C. Williams, says that while interactors, the vehicles are needed for selection to act upon the gene, is the ultimate beneficiary and therefore the real unit of selection.
So the organism is just a temporary carrier for the genes.
Yeah, like a vessel.
And it's the genes that are really being selected over evolutionary time.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
then we have genic pluralism, which takes this idea even further.
Okay, how so?
Genic pluralists say that all selection, no matter the level, can be explained in terms of genic selection.
So they're saying that everything ultimately boils down to the genes.
Yeah, they claim there's a kind of equivalence between genic and multi-level models.
Equivalence in the sense that, You can always translate a story about selection at the organism or group level into a story about genes.
Exactly. But the source looks at this critically.
What do they say?
They point out that genic pluralists often downplay or even deny the importance of interactors.
So they're saying that the interactors are just along for the ride.
Yeah, but even Dawkins himself admitted that interactors are important. He said that genes don't directly interact with the environment. It's through their effects on the interactors that selection happens.
Right, the genes need a body to work through.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that even big proponents of genic selectionism knew that you need interactors for evolution to work.
So it seems like a bit of an oversimplification to say that it's all about the genes.
Yeah, the philosophical arguments against eugenic pluralism often say that you lose important information when you only focus on the genes.
What kind of information?
By ignoring the interactor level, you miss the ecological interactions that actually cause the selection event.
So you're missing the context.
Right, and there are also problems with trying to translate multi-level models into geogenic ones without losing important details about what's happening at those higher levels.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, next up we have units of evolutionary transition in individuality ETI.
ETI.
This seems to be about a different aspect of units in evolution.
It is. ETIs are about those big events where lower-level entities come together to form a new, higher-level individual.
Like the jump from single-celled to multicellular life. So it's about how we get these new, more complex levels that can then be subject to natural selection.
Precisely. Maynard Smith and Seth Mary, often coming from that adaptationist kin selection viewpoint,
Yeah.
focused on the challenges of keeping this integration stable and preventing cheaters, those lower-level entities that might exploit the system.
Right.
Godfrey Smith tends to see ETIs as leading to new Darwinian populations that can then evolve on their own.
And how does this relate to the multi-level selection framework we've been talking about?
The source points out that the multi-level selection view doesn't necessarily require the lower-level individuality to be completely suppressed for selection to happen at higher levels.
Okay.
Selection can be acting on multiple levels at the same time. This doesn't always mean a complete transition in individuality.
So it's not always a clean break.
Right.
Okay, last but not least, we have holobionts and demibionts.
Holobionts and demibionts, this is a hot topic in evolutionary biology right now.
It is, so the holobiont, the host plus all its microbes, has raised the question of whether the whole thing can be a unit of selection.
So the organism and all its little passengers together.
And just like with group and species selection, this debate has been muddled by not separating the interactor manifestor reproducer and beneficiary roles.
Right, so we need to ask, do they interact cohesively as a whole? Do they have adaptations at the holobiont level? Do they reproduce as one? And who ultimately benefits?
All great questions, and researchers are exploring them right now. Some are skeptical of holobionts as units of selection, while others argue they're functionally important.
Okay.
The source contrasts the ETI approach to holobiont evolution, which often focuses on controlling cheaters within the holobiont, with the multi-level selection perspective, which allows for simultaneous selection at different levels, and says that cooperation can be a self-reinforcing process.
Different ways of looking at the same thing.
And what about demibionts?
Demibionts are similar to holobionts, but with a focus on the potentially different evolutionary histories between the host and its symbionts.
Okay.
So in a demibiont, one or more lineages might have adapted to the host, but not necessarily vice versa in a tightly co-evolved way.
So it's not as much of a unified unit.
Right, and this challenges our traditional ideas of units of selection based on reproduction, because a demibiont might not reproduce as a single whole in the classic sense.
So if we strictly define a unit by its ability to reproduce together, a demibiont might not fit.
Exactly.
But if we focus on the interactor role where the interaction with the environment happens, it might still be a level where selection is acting.
Right. It all depends on what we're focusing on.
And this brings us back to that crucial point about separating those different research questions.
Right, the different lenses.
The source concludes that whether a holobiont or demibiont is a unit of selection depends entirely on which role or question we're asking.
That makes sense.
Okay, so to sum all of this up for our philosopher listeners, it seems that evolutionary biology is just as complex and nuanced as philosophy.
It really is.
The answer to what is the unit of selection depends on how you ask the question and what you're trying to understand.
And what's really interesting from a philosophical perspective is how the way we define our terms and the questions we ask shape the answers we find, both in philosophy and in evolutionary biology.
Yeah, it's all connected.
The source makes it clear that this is an active area of research where evidence and ideas are constantly being refined.
So the key takeaway for our philosophers is that identifying units of selection is much trickier than it seems.
Right.
It's like in philosophy, the framework you use shapes your conclusions.
And this isn't a settled debate. It's an ongoing exploration of the different roles that things can play in evolution.
This brings up a fascinating question for you to think about.
What's that?
If the idea of a single unit of selection is really a combination of multiple roles, interactor, reproducer, manifestor, beneficiary, how might this change how we think about agency and individuality in other complex systems?
That's a great question to ponder.
Could this evolutionary framework, with its focus on different levels, offer new ways of thinking about reductionism and holism in philosophy? Maybe by being careful about what's acting versus what's being acted upon, we can understand parts and wholes in a new light in any complex system.
That's definitely worth exploring further.
It is.